Hi, everyone. Today I will be presenting on John Calvin, practicing divine accommodation to manifest God's love, based on Kenneth R. Chase's analysis of Calvin's theology. Calvin's whole approach to pastoral communication is shaped by the idea that God adapts his communication to human limitations, not as manipulation, but as direct expression of divine love. Right in the abstract, the author points out that Calvin uses the idea of divine accommodation to explain how God communicates in ways humans can actually understand. Calvin sometimes sounds like he separates God's strategy from the message, especially when talking about passages like John 11. But ultimately, he argues that accommodation reflects God's loving character. One clear example of this comes from the outline. Calvin teaches that God adapts communication to human limitation. This is the foundation of everything else we are going to look at today, making himself accessible because he loves humanity. To understand Calvin's communication and philosophy, we have to look at how he understood ministry. Calvin believe that pastoral ministry should mirror the way God himself communicates. God bridges the divine human gap by adjusting revelation to fit the flight of his people. In other words, God does not simply speak at one lofty divine level, he meets us right where we are. This raises a big theological question. Does divine intention always match divine expression? If God adapts, does that mean the true message gets changed? Calvin doesn't see accommodation as watering down truth. He sees it as the way God chooses to reach limited creatures. And we see this with an example from the text is that God speaks at their level, meaning he intentionally shapes his message so that humans can understand it. This becomes Calvin's model for how Christian communication should function, always adapting out of love, never out of deception. One of the most powerful illustrations of accommodation for Calvin is found in John 11, the story of Lazarus. Calvin sees the whole chapter as a masterclass of how God communicates with humans. First, Jesus delays going to Bethany. Calvin argues that this wasn't a mistake or neglect, but an intentional strategy so the resurrection would be a public event that strengthens the faith of many. Jesus adjusting the timing of the miracle so that people can't understand who he is more clearly. Second, Jesus prayed aloud at the tomb. This is the most explicit example of accommodation in the chapter. Calvin says Jesus did not pray out loud for his own sake. He prayed so that the crowd would understand what God was about to do. So we're seeing that Calvin was pointing out the fact that, hey, if Jesus didn't pray out loud, it doesn't change the fact that he is God in human form. He did this to prove that he was God in human form, to point out the huge miracle that Jesus performed. And third, Jesus weeps. His emotional expression shows sincere compassion and makes divine love accessible. Calvin says even Christ's emotions function as a accommodation. God enters our emotional world to communicate his heart. So, yet again, Calvin is pointing out in this chapter about Lazarus that Christ is both fully man and fully God. He used the miracle to prove to the people as witnesses that he was both fully God and fully man. And we're still seeing how God can let us know, and how Calvin is arguing that this is divine accommodation. Jesus chose to let the people see who he truly was on something they could understand on their own level. Even through accommodation is rooted in love, there is a tension Calvin wrestles with. Sometimes he describes accommodation in a way that sounds very strategic, almost like God is using rhetorical technique. If taken too far, this could create a separation between God's intention and his message, and that could make God sound manipulative. Calvin rejects that idea, but the tension remains. To understand why we have to see where Calvin sits in rhetorical history, he stands between two traditions: Renaissance rhetoric, where persuasion was tied to moral character, a good man speaking well, compared to modern rhetoric, which focuses on strategically technique and persuasion regardless of moral character. Calvin uniquely sometimes reflects both. His pastoral communication is deeply ethical, but when he describes God's communication, it is sometimes sounds more like technique. This becomes very relevant today, especially in Christian communication shaped by entertainment culture. And what I think Calvin was hinting at there is that, hey, the media can sometimes be in the message. We don't need to make that mistake as Christians. Should the media be more than the entertainment, or the media more than, excuse me, should entertainment take precedent over what actually the Bible actually means? And the text gives a wonderful example about a church camp where teens show up for jet skis, concerts, and high energy entertainment. And they worry that Jesus becomes a secondary thing. So we're seeing that in the modern world that entertainment is becoming a huge factor in Christianity, much more so than it was previously. To close, Calvin ultimately resolves the tension by rooting accommodation in God's nature. God's adjustments aren't strategic tricks, they are expression of his love. Calvin calls this God's wonderful condensing, meaning God stoops down not to manipulate, but to lovingly reveal himself. Christ's humility and incarnation are the ultimate demonstrations of this. God gains nothing from manipulating humanity. His persona is entirely self giving, or his persuasion is entirely self giving. This gives us a framework for Christian communication today. Adaptation is necessary, strategy is sometimes helpful, but communication must always be grounded in love, not technique. Calvin shows us that divine accommodation is the model of communication style rooted in care, compassion, and desire to reach people where they are. As Chase writes, when persuasion is rooted in divine love, it becomes the everyday performance of love. That is the heart of Calvin's vision for communication.